I would like to introduce Jason Kybert and Professor Mitchell Lerner and Major General Dennis Leitch. The moderator is Jason Kybert, who's in the middle. He's a visiting professor here at Otterbein in political science. He earned his PhD in international relations at Ohio State in 2014. His research focuses on the intersection of technology and international politics. His current project traces the internationalization of counterterrorism surveillance. Our two panelists are Professor Mitchell Lerner and Major General Dennis Leitch. Mitch is a professor of history, associate professor of history, and director of the Institute for Korean Studies at The Ohio State University, where he's also a faculty member at the Mershon Center for National Security Studies. He's been a fellow at the Miller Center for Public Affairs at the University of Virginia, served on the governing council of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, and has held the Mary Ball Washington Distinguished Fulbright Chair in American Diplomatic History at University College Dublin. He is currently the associate editor of the Journal of American East Asian Relations and is on the board of advisors for the North Korean International Documentation Project in Washington, D.C. Major General Dennis Leitch retired from the U.S. Army in 2006 after more than 35 years service. He has served in Iraq, Kuwait, Germany, Netherlands, and Honduras. He's a graduate of the Army War College, the Command and General Staff College, and the National Security Management Program. His military awards include the Defense Distinguished Service Award and the Legion of Merit. In addition to an undergraduate degree in political science and 2 master's degrees, he has completed postgraduate studies in national security at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He currently serves as the director of the Patriots Program at Ohio Dominican University and chairs the Military Advisory Committee of the National Veterans Memorial Museum. He is the author of Skin in the Game, Poor Kids, and Patriots. And both Professor Lerner and Major General Dennis Leitch are members of Ohio Indivisible District 12. Go District 12! So without further ado, I want to hand over to you.
Hi everybody, thanks for coming. The other day, a colleague of mine walked into my office and saw the pamphlet on my table, National Security in the Age of Trump, and he joked, is there national security in the age of Trump? We're going to start out talking
As did we all.
I laughed and then a tear fell. We'll start off talking about North Korea. So I'm sure much more background will be provided as the gentleman discussed the issue, but in 2006, North Korea tests its first nuclear weapon, and essentially since then it's been developing them, and there tends to be 2 distinct phenomena here of interest to the United States, and that is as North Korea develops a nuclear weapon, and as North Korea develops a missile that could then deliver that weapon. The international community, by and large, there's a consensus that the North Koreans are in the wrong here and need to change course. And over the past couple of years now, the United Nations Security Council has been ratcheting up sanctions, and I believe now it's about 90% of North Korea's public exports are sanctioned. So I think it would be nice to sort of lay the groundwork and ask the first question: what is driving the North Koreans?
How much time do we have? Welcome, everyone. Let me say thank you before we even have any conversation. I want to say thanks to my fellow panelists. It's an honor to be here. General, thank you for your years of service to our country. And I want to say thanks to Indivisible for the invitation to come tonight and for everything that you guys do. I have found you a bit of a lifeline in the wake of some what I would consider, I won't prejudge for everybody in the room, some tragic political events over the last year. And Indivisible has given me an outlet to get involved and to fight what I think is a good fight. So I'd urge you, if you're not part of Indivisible, speak with one of its leaders and take a moment to find out what you can do to get involved. I know that the rules as we established was that we're going to kind of talk at you for the first half and then turn it over for questions. But I want to say I'm perfectly welcome, perfectly happy to have a conversation. So if I say something that like you absolutely need, you want to say something right then and there, please just wave at me. I'm perfectly happy to. In fact, it's almost Thanksgiving. My mother-in-law will come for the holidays, and she's unable to ever control a thought that enters her head. So this is good practice for me. If I say something and you feel like you need to respond, well, she'll be the same way about absolutely everything. So feel free to chime in. So let's talk about North Korea. Now, as you heard from my bio, I'm the director of the Institute for Korean Studies. I'm also 5'6", and I'm having a really hard time making eye contact in the back. So bear with me for a minute as I stand, or even sit. I hope you gentlemen don't mind, but as the shortest person always in the room, I can never make eye contact. Just where I can see everybody. Right, thank you. You and I, yeah. Solidarity. So let me. I don't mean to monopolize, but North Korea is what I do. So let me talk a little bit about where we are and how we got here. First, I note that we're only speculating as to what North Korean motivations are, and I could probably spend the next hour explaining to you the long history of North Korean ideology and all sorts of other things that are probably less relevant, because in the end the bigger question is whether or not it's going to propel us towards war. I'll note that I am just now home from Korea. I was invited by the South Korean Foreign Ministry a couple weeks ago to do some kind of quiet behind-the-scenes sort of conversations to talk about events and the relationship between our two countries. I had a wonderful trip. I met with the Minister of Unification. I met with the Deputy Director General for the North Korean nuclear program. I met with the Director General of the North American Bureau of the equivalent of their State Department. I met with their Minister for Popular Culture, all sorts of people that we met. I would tell you that, I'll give you a couple sort of broad strokes here, takeaways from my conversations with the people I met that maybe will give you a better idea of where we are and some of the dangers that I think we face. First, I would note that this is a situation where I have some sympathy towards the Trump administration for. They inherited a really bad situation. This is something we've known about the North Korean nuclear program and how serious it's been since the 1980s, and no one has taken it seriously enough, or at least been willing to do what is necessary to deal with it. The only leader who actually ever almost took us there was Clinton in 1994. You have no idea how close we almost came to war with North Korea in, literally minutes. And if we have time later, I can tell you that really incredible story. But beyond that, we've known about it and we've sort of turned a blind eye. And that's left us in the problem that we have now, and one in which President Trump really has very few good alternatives, if any. Even so, it worries me not so much that he's missing an opportunity for a solution, because I don't think that there is a solution, but what worries me is the extent to which he's making the problem potentially worse. What do I mean by that? And I mean a couple things. One is that the president clearly doesn't seem to understand the impact that his words have. And sometimes those are tweets and sometimes those are words, but he clearly, I think, sort of shoots from the hip and doesn't understand that in his position as commander-in-chief, every sentence, every syllable, every is parsed by foreign governments to see what the true meaning is. And so when he fires off in the middle of a tense situation, for example, that at the height of the potential crisis with North Korea, it might be time to revisit the Korea-U.S. free trade agreement, or it might be time to increase the amount of financial compensation we demand from South Korea for the THAAD anti-missile system, it complicates our situation in terms of complicating our relationship with South Korea. I think that the problem that we face here is not that war is going to come as a planned event. And I get asked this all the time. At least once or twice a day, a friend of mine will say, hey, give me at least half an hour's notice so I can get out of town before the bombs start falling. I don't worry about that. There are cool-headed individuals involved in the foreign policy making apparatus for both the United States and North Korea. I don't think the Trump administration is sitting there weighing the pros and cons and having a detailed study of the impact of launching a first strike against North Korea. What worries me is that that's not how wars start. Wars in the 20th century usually begin because some individual does some small action and it spirals out of control. And whether that's because of miscalculation or domestic politics or some lower level functionary who does something from which there is no backing down, that's how we go to war, or that's how tensions take us at least almost to the brink of war. And so what worries me about the current crisis is that the president's words create an air of tension that makes this problem more likely. When I was in Korea, the two things I heard over and over again from government officials, from South Korean government officials, One was, as I've said, doesn't the president understand that every time he says something, he makes it worse? Right? In the eyes of South Korea, nothing different. There's nothing different going on here. There's 14,000 pieces of artillery along the DMZ pointed at Seoul. North Korea has 5,000 tons of chemical and biological weapons. To them, the advent of a nuclear weapon really doesn't change the dimensions very much. I mean, whether you die because you're hit by a nuclear bomb or whether you die because they drop botulism on you, not so much of a difference, really. So, in their eyes, the circumstances haven't changed all that much. And so President Trump's ratcheting up of the rhetoric and the tension makes things a little bit worse. The other issue that I have seen, and this finally gets us back to your original point of what is North Korea trying to do. I think there's a lot of things that North Korea is trying to do, but one of the things they're trying to do is drive a wedge between the United States and its allies, and it's succeeding. Japan and South Korea in particular. And the most shocking thing to me, and I admit I'm biased, right? I'm a specialist in U.S.-Korean relations. This is what I study. So maybe I have a higher opinion of the importance of South Korea than most people do. But I've always believed that there's three nations in the world that the U.S. has kind of a special relationship with, kind of an ideological partnership with, and that's Israel, the British, and South Korea. And that our relationship with those nations is ironclad. It's literally, in the case of Korea, been forged in blood. And that I never doubt that the American people would rally behind the need to defend South Korea as our great ally in the region, both for emotional and strategic purposes. Well, the thing that I got thrown at me most when I traveled South Korea was the question, will the United States really live up to its agreement? Would the United States really fight for Seoul the way they would for Los Angeles? Because we've heard that, they said, for decade and decade, we've been promised the United States will be there for us, and now we're starting to doubt it. And that was kind of shocking to me. And I would say, why do you doubt it? And they would say, first of all, there's the president's rhetoric. Right? How good of an ally can we really be if he's saying you're not paying enough for the THAAD missile system that we gave you to design to keep you safe? But beyond that, there's the fact that in their eyes, the situation hasn't changed all that much. Right? How come the United States didn't care so much when the North could hit Seoul with biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons? Or even when they could eradicate Seoul, 25 million people, by conventional weapons, and the U.S. wasn't all, going crazy. Now Donald Trump is talking fire and fury because the United States is in danger. Right? If it really mattered so much that the United States would defend South Korea, how come we weren't just as mad when this threat existed only to South Korea? And I think that's put us in a position where, particularly when you start thinking about the increased trade between South Korea and China and the expansion of Chinese influence in the region, it's really put us in a bad position with regard to our allies in the region. I can talk forever about South Korea. I will step back, gentlemen.
I would only add that we are in the process of alienating a number of our historic allies throughout the world. I'm reminded of the knight who spends the day about his business and is invited to have dinner at the king's table, and the king asks him, "What have you done all day today?" And he said, "Sire, I've been about defeating your enemies to the south." And he says, "I have no enemies to the south." And the knight says, "You do now." So Donald Trump has alienated not only or called into question our relationship with South Korea, but a host of other nations, and it's alarming. I have a great concern that if a kinetic war starts on the Korean Peninsula, it will expand, it could expand dramatically. And one of the things we talk about in the military is not only the probability, but the severity of different events. And the probability may be medium or low, but the severity is extreme because there are a number of countries that have interests on the Korean Peninsula, to include the United States, and there are China and Russia. Most people don't realize that North Korea shares a border with Russia at its extreme north. So I'm deeply concerned about what happens. I think a reasonable question that's not being asked by the American people, or more importantly, Congress, under their constitutional obligation in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, how many thousands of people, civilians, Korean civilians, and American citizens living in Seoul would die in the first 96 hours of a war? How many American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines would die in a war on the Korean Peninsula? And how long would the war last? And how much would it cost? And who would serve? These are questions that the American people ought to be asking the leaders who are in the process of marching us toward a war on the Korean Peninsula. And to Mitch's point about personalities, we can't ignore the fact that there are traditional geopolitical dynamics in place in this issue. But there are also some different personalities on either side that are unique. And you know, if you look at these two personalities involved, on the one hand, you have a undisciplined, sociopathic, inexperienced, fat guy with a bad haircut and nukes, and on the other side, you have Kim Jong-un. So this creates a different set of problems than that which we've seen before. And I'm deeply concerned as someone who has seen what these kinds of issues can devolve into in Iraq and Afghanistan, where, by the way, we had wars of choice and preventive wars. And to a large extent, this would be a preventive war. I think that I heard Mitch say that there are limited choices involved here. I think what we'll get down to is really a binary choice. We are either going to live with and try to contain a nuclear-armed North Korea, or we're going to have a kinetic war that would have the potential consequences that I just outlined.
Yeah, if you want to get really scared, I don't know how many, I'm sure you're all going to be really scared. If you saw the Quinnipiac poll on Thursday, 46% of Republicans are in favor of a first strike against North Korea. I mean, understand the consequences of that. 5,000 tons of biological and chemical weapons. We don't know how many nuclear missiles, but enough that Seoul will be absolutely devastated. There's 100,000 Americans in Korea. There's an equivalent number in Japan. There's China on the border. I mean, this is such a horrific situation that, so a war with North Korea is not winnable. Now, it's winnable in the sense that the United States would militarily prove victorious. But the damage, and I don't just mean the physical damage, although that's significant, and the damage to the international economy. Right? South Korea is the world's 11th largest economy. So the damage on a practical level is incredible. But it goes well beyond that. Right? South Korea is one of our great allies. President Moon has made it quite clear he's not welcoming an American first strike. So we've damaged our relationship with one of our great allies. Then there's China, which is the great power in the region, and we already have a tense relationship with China. They sure don't want that either. Even then, think about the consequences. Now, North Korea has dug its missiles into caves. They have mobile missile launchers. They have now developed solid fuel technology. There's no way we get everything. So even if North Korea, even conventional militarily, we wipe out the North Korean forces, what we're left with is likely a guerrilla warfare in the north, with people, absolute fury of hatred of the American people, armed with the remaining residue of chemical and biological weapons, who, oh, by the way, also have ties to Hamas, Hezbollah, and Syria, in a region where, on their border, they're going to get unlimited supplies through China and Russia. It's an absolutely horrible situation. And so I think you're right. I mean, the only option that is reasonable, the only option I dare say that is sane, is to rely on a diplomatic approach that strengthens our alliances in the region to keep North Korea in control to the extent that we can. Assume, I think correctly, that the North Korean leadership is rational, they don't want to die either, and that over the course of the next 5-10 years, the growing signs of penetration of the North by Western culture and economics will destabilize the regime, and what comes next will be better. But the other option that we're talking about, that 46% of registered Republicans favor, is a calamity the likes of which we haven't seen, I mean, almost in modern memory.
I would add that I think Mitch is absolutely right with regard to diplomacy. The irony is that the Trump administration has recommended a 30 to 40% cut in the State Department and USAID. We do not have an ambassador to South Korea. In the midst of this crisis, we do not have an ambassador appointed to South Korea. Furthermore, if you look at the relationship in between the United States and China, the United States, well, Trump has said that it's basically up to China to step up and get North Korea in line. The fact is that many people believe that we have different interests in the Korean Peninsula. China is perfectly comfortable, at least for the time being, having a a divided Korean peninsula. What the United States envisions is a unified Korean peninsula under the control of Seoul, which puts a U.S. Ally on the Chinese border and U.S. troops on the Chinese border. There is no reason to believe that the Chinese would be any more ready to accept this than the United States would be to have Mexico be an ally of China on our southern border, or Canada. So the dynamics here are altogether different, and we have to remember that every sovereign nation in the world acts in their best interests, and the interests often don't coincide.
Yeah, so the general, sorry, I know we're supposed to be asking questions and we're just talking.
No.
We feel like welcome to my you're welcome to my world. So the general makes an important point, and let's use that maybe as a window to broaden this a little bit. So he mentions 30% cut, 38% cut to State Department and USAID programs. We don't have an ambassador to South Korea. Not only that, we don't have an assistant secretary for Pacific and East Asian affairs. We've eliminated the position of North Korean envoy for human rights. And all sorts of other programs. At the same time, of course, the original budget proposal was a $500 million increase in military spending or whatever it was. It goes to a larger point, I think, about the Trump administration, which is that they evaluate foreign policy. They define security in two ways, and one is economic power and the other is military power. And they have no commitment to what we think of as soft power or cultural diplomacy. And so we've seen huge cuts to that element of American foreign policy, which I think if you go back and you look over the history of the Cold War, you see how incredibly vital it is. So I was just reading an article, just to take us off Korea for a moment, about Colombia. We have been, the budget for 2016 was $200 million in aid for developmental programs to Colombia. And that's partly because there's recently been an agreement between the revolutionaries, the FARC, and the Colombian government, and it's kind of a tenuous agreement, and this money is doing a number of things, including paying to have more government officials in the rural areas of Colombia. It's also, they've set up a program to pay rural farmers in Colombia to, instead of growing cocaine, to grow other things. Well, they're cutting $50 million out of that budget, from $200 million to, it might be from $250 million down to $200 million by 2018. And it's just a small amount, but when you think about the long-term investment, the long-term interest of the United States, what the Trump administration doesn't recognize is these sort of developmental programs and these sort of soft power programs create a world that's more stable for the United States. And this, I think, goes to a fundamental failure. So here's the fundamental failure, I think, of the Trump administration. And historians will argue whether we want to start this in 1945 or 1917 or go all the way back to the Revolution. But at least since 1945, there's a fundamental assumption, I think, that has underlain American foreign policy. And whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or whatever, there's a fundamental framework that we use. And we call it liberal internationalism. And many of you are probably familiar with this phrase. And what we say in the history and political science world is American interests, particularly since World War II, have been rooted in the idea that we should do whatever we can to expand the goals of liberal internationalism. And by liberal internationalism, I don't mean liberal in a domestic sense of, gay marriage or stem cell warning or stem cell research or global warming or anything. I mean a commitment to certain principles that sort of modern capitalist nations accept. And that means things like a commitment to free trade, commitment to private property, the trappings, at least, of a democratic system, steps towards gender equality, free press. These are things that have defined the United States and its allies for a number of generations. Now, different administrations have had larger or weaker commitments to these goals, but the assumption has been we need to advance the interests of those countries that believe in these values, and countries that don't, we need to push them in that direction, because that makes a safer and more prosperous world for all of us in the long run. Trump is the first president, I think, to reject those values. Right? And I know that, like Reagan, Clinton, Eisenhower, they didn't always share the same policies of advancing those goals, but the framework was always there. That framework has been rejected. I was reading an article the other day that coined the phrase, what did they call it? It was a cost-benefit unilateralism. That was the word they used. Cost-benefit unilateralism. That Trump was putting our foreign policy based on a framework of immediate short-term benefit rather than long-term strategic gain. It was, how much could this benefit us in the short run without thinking these cultural, these development programs that you're referring to make a more stable and safer world for the United States. That inspired me, so I'm working on an article now, and I'm calling it From Liberal Internationalism to Walmart Unilateralism. And I'm talking about, and I know it's kind of a joke, but I mean it in the sense that I think many of the values that we associate with Walmart are equivalent to what we're seeing in the Trump administration. And I'm not singling out Walmart. I think this is a whole worldview that is emerging now. But it's rooted in a couple basic principles. One is this short-term cost-benefit analysis. Another is the idea that as the big boy on the block, we get to boss other people around, right? We get to push our way, even if that hurts local communities, right? It's also, I'm talking about how Walmart, like I think the United States, has no sort of permanent alliance system right now, right? Walmart is about getting what you can out of your suppliers and treating your employees as if they are a resource to be drained rather than an equal partner. And that's where the Trump administration is right now. Every country, every problem, every crisis that is to be dealt with is dealt with on a very short-term basis of how does this benefit us economically, how does it benefit the Trump administration politically, and the long-term consequences of that are significant. And so what we're seeing, I think, are an administration willing to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and ceding that area to China, because that didn't, in a short run, that was costing us money. Or whether it means pulling us out of the global warming agreement, or any of the other things that the administration has done, because they're costing us money maybe in the short run without recognizing the long-term consequences to the liberal world order. Sorry.
An easy and maybe a more simplistic way to put that, I think, is that Trump, by his nature, is transactional. International politics is strategic, and he is not a strategic thinker. He is a transactional thinker. That's his nature. That's the business that he grew up in. And the other one that I would point out is that this idea of a world order that came out of World War II that the United States built and had allies is now being challenged. And it's not just being challenged by bad actors, but it's being challenged by others who now see nationalism as a more viable course than it was before. You see a rising China that is in a position in many cases, particularly in the Western Pacific, to challenge the United States, and a Russia that's more assertive than it's been since the fall of the Soviet Union. So you have a number of forces coming into play that drive that dynamic that Professor Lerner is talking about. But you also have the kind of history that we go back to. And it was a British diplomat in the 19th century that said, Britain has no friends and no enemies. It has interests. And this is the thing that's driving world politics today. There are nationalistic interests where the United States is declining, and it's also driven by a classicist in this area, Noam Chomsky, who's an old curmudgeon in Boston who's written voluminously for decades, who said that there are three things that drive every country's foreign policy. The first one is strong countries do what they want and weak countries figure out how to put up with it. The second one is that every country's intelligentsia and wealthy drive their foreign policy. And the third one is that winners forget and losers remember. So you have these three dynamics that are truisms going back as long as we've studied history and as long as we've studied geopolitics. So there's a shift taking place in geopolitical dynamics and balance throughout the world that I think drives what you're talking about.
Okay, so, how are we doing, Tony?
Good, you're fine.
I want to turn back to North Korea real quickly for the sake of the crowd. Are you both in the same opinion that at this point in time the United States needs to learn to live with a nuclear North Korea? Yes. Yes.
Look at that. We can just bang one word. Yes, it's not going to be
make sure that
easy,
comes through.
And I know it's a shock to American audiences, but...
And here's the other thing I would point out. Kim Jong-un, we would like to think that he's an irrational actor. And the fact of the matter is that he and his two predecessors have run a country for 70 years through all sorts of turmoil, all sorts of world order changes, and he's succeeded in maintaining his position of power. The other one is that he is perhaps he believes in assassination, but not suicide. And detonating a nuclear device or attacking South Korea unprovoked would be suicide. It would be ugly, it would be perhaps lengthy, but it would be suicide. So like all tyrants, his principal objective is
How
to...
do you know that?
Pardon me?
How do you know that that's his thinking, assassination and not suicide?
It's rational. I mean, if he was going to do that, he would have done something crazy before. The other thing that he looks at is that that there's a history of giving up nuclear weapons. Muammar Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons and lost we sold it, we threw him under the bus, really. Saddam Hussein gave up his nuclear weapons and he's gone. So he sits there and he says, what's the rational thing to do? I think he's a rational actor. Now, we may not like his thinking, we may not like the consequences of it, but he's a rational actor.
Yeah, and I would note as well that there's no signs of imminent war preparation inside the North. I mean, for all of the belligerent rhetoric, and it's always fun to read what North Korea has said each morning because it's just so crazy. Today we're going to turn you into a whatever. Inside the country, there's no signs that they are preparing.
Nor is there any overt indication that the United States is moving military resources into that theater. The consensus is that it would take about 2 months for us to get sufficient forces mustered in that area in order to execute a ground, air, and naval war in North Korea, and there is no movement of military assets on the part of the United States or our allies into that theater.
Okay, one more question on North Korea then.
I think let's just change it up, and
Okay.
I'll do my actions at the end, and let's just keep the conversation going, and then when people want to ask questions, let's just go ahead and do it that way.
Okay.
I would note that there are also track 2 negotiations with North Korea going on right now. The Trump administration will deny it, but there are quiet negotiations going on between on American side, non-governmental officials. From the North Korean side, government officials who are slightly less visual. So that's kind of cheerful. But on the other hand, understand, I don't want to sugarcoat this, what it means if North Korea does develop nuclear technology and the ability to hit the United States. This is the worst country in the world, and arguably the worst country in modern world history. And Americans are only paying attention to it now because of the nuclear program. Understand that that they have concentration camps there that are full of torture, human experimentation, where millions have died. Understand that they are one of the world's leading counterfeiters. Understand that they are one of the world's leading producers of meth and opium. Understand that they are active in the nuclear black market. This is a place that has its finger in every international problem, whether it's supplying weapons to Pakistan or Syria or smuggling things. There's a governmental organization, I don't remember what it's called, who tracks the number of times an embassy is used to smuggle illegal goods in or out of countries, because you get the diplomatic pouch. You can bring things in and out of embassies. Since 1986, I think there's been 31 times when a country has illegally smuggled goods through their embassy. 18 of them are North Korea. I mean, this is the worst place in the world before they have the ability to hit the United States with a nuclear weapon. Think about what they're going to be like now. So, I'm cheered by the fact that it probably means that despite all the rhetoric, we're not going to war with North Korea, and I don't think that as you say, Kim Jong-un is irrational and looking for war. At the same time, let's understand what these consequences are, and they're god-awful.
I would just point out, before we make any great moral judgments about the North Koreans, and I don't believe there are any Boy Scouts in the North Korean leadership, but there are a host of countries that are allies that have similar issues. I mean, Pakistan is the biggest proliferator of nuclear technology to other countries in the world. You have an Egyptian regime that is part of our list of allies that's hardly a beacon of Jeffersonian democracy. We can go on and on.
Yeah, so the general and I will disagree there. I think North Korea is unique. I mean, they take babies from when they are born, and in order to indoctrinate them into the cult of personality of the Kim family, they basically go to schools where they are fed by North Korean minders and with pictures of Kim Jong-un and the Kim family, so they'll associate that with the Kim family. When you're in kindergarten and you go to school in North Korea, they give you food, because everyone is starving in North Korea, and they give you food when you arrive, and you have to, and the teacher gives it to you and says, this is from Kim Jong-un because he loves you. You can end up in a prison camp, and if you violate any one of the political rules, which could be things like forgetting to wear a button of Kim Jong-un on your chest, or not adequately dusting the picture of the Kim family that is required to be on your wall at all times, not only might you end up in a Kwanliso, a prison camp where you can be tortured and starved to death, but 3 generations of your family go with you.
All I'm saying is, let's not paint or conflate the nuclear issue, which is a specific issue, with moral judgments on different
Right.
regimes.
Fair enough.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Will.
So you're talking about possibly accepting a nuclear Korea, North Korea. So could that be more damaging in the long run, because accepting them in the international community as a nuclear power will give them a certain amount of standing on the world stage, just like Russia, China, Pakistan. So could that not be more damaging in the long run to the international order than a, albeit terrible, war for one generation?
Well, I think that when you ask that question, you assume that they're going to use it. And the other thing is that maybe that's what Kim Jong-un wants, the respect of being a nuclear power, recognized as a nuclear power. And oftentimes, when you have countries that break through the nuclear threshold, like Pakistan and others, it's not that they immediately become bellicose and flex their muscles. The fact of the matter is that they still have a responsibility, or the threat of being attacked with other nuclear weapons from other countries. So let's recognize one thing. There's only one country that's ever deployed nuclear weapons in anger in the history of the world, and that's the United States. And I think we need to be a little bit careful about claiming the moral high ground in these issues, given the fact that we're the only ones. Now, we have done a great deal to thwart or to control nuclear proliferation, but the fact of the matter is that we're the only